For this particular session, our learning outcome is that participants self-reflect and create space for others to reflect on how their own identities influence their perspective and bias in evaluation in order to design evaluations that regularly question and try to address inequities. And our objectives are that participants will consider critically the idea that any evaluation can be objective, reflect on how their identities and lived experiences shape their perspective and biases, and discuss the implications of their identity, perspective, and bias on their/an evaluation approach and design. So just want to ground you in the outcomes and objectives that we have. Thanks for forwarding the slide, Libby. So let's dig in. Can evaluation be objective? And this might sound like a silly question, but I want to stress that there are limitations that come with any perspective. And in particular, if you're looking at this animation, this cartoon, you'll see that there are two people on either side of a number, and they are interpreting that number different ways based on where they are located to the number. And when you think about evaluation, you might have heard a lot of people like to say that evaluation is objective because it's numbers. And people like to stress that numbers are very sorry. And I came to campus to make sure that I wouldn't have internet problems. So what I was saying about numbers is that a lot of times when people talk about numbers, when they talk about evaluation and research, they gravitate to numbers because they think it's objective and there's one truth. If you've seen this cartoon before, you have probably heard some of the philosophical questions around it, around whether there is one reality with a capital R, or there are multiple interpretations of reality that we each have based on our lived experiences, the identities that we hold, and the positionality that we have in the different communities and groups that we're moving in and through. So this quote by Dr. Sean Wilson is one that we wanted to ground everybody in, which is, we cannot remove ourselves from the world in order to examine it, because you are examining the world through your own lenses, through the lived experiences that you've had, through the identities and groups that you claim membership to. And it's important to know that values are facts and facts are value laden. So facts are based off of the values that people have within the different groups that they have membership to. So no matter what methods are used, facts cannot be neutral or value free because they're influenced by our beliefs and values. And somebody had to make a decision on what counts as a credible source or evidence, what data to collect, how to collect that data, how to analyze it, and how to interpret it, which leads to the next slide. If you could advance, Libby. Numbers aren't neutral. Now, this is a little bit of a play on words, in that we have all heard on our team folks say that numbers are neutral because they believe that they are a fact and that they can only mean one thing. However, numbers can be neutral if we are only talking about the symbol or the object, but the minute a person decides to interpret it, we are talking about data, and data cannot be neutral because it is based on your identities, your lived experiences. So the document that Deborah is sharing in chat is the We All Count list of choices, which has 99 questions in 4 or 5 different buckets that we should be looking at in terms of how we are evaluating, how we're picking questions to answer, how we are picking questions to answer what we would like to hear, how we are questioning the answers we're receiving. Those are all important to thinking about what kind of data are we gathering and what does that data mean? And all of that is informed by our identities and culture. So if we can advance the slide, please. just to give you an update, which you've seen this before in some of our other trainings, when we talk about identity, we are referring to the qualities, traits, and characteristics that define who we are based on our social group membership. There are quite a few identities that can evolve. For instance, I am a doctoral candidate and I hope to have my doctorate at the end of a year. So that is an evolution in that particular identity that I hold. And our identities filter our perceptions and impacts our action and who we are. You've also probably heard folks talk about identity as the sum of all your social identities. So I'm a Black woman who's an immigrant and queer and a doctoral candidate and so on and so forth. Now, when we talk about culture, thank you, Libby, culture is referring to a set of shared ideas, customs, traditions, beliefs, and practices that are shared by a group of people that is constantly changing in subtle and major ways. It affects how people learn, remember, reason, solve problems, and communicate. So culture is a defining part of a person's identity, and it contributes to how they see themselves and the groups that they are part of, that they have membership in. So it is helpful for us to understand what our identities are and what our culture is in relationship to those identities as we are moving through this evaluation journey. So we understand not only the context of our viewpoints and lived experiences and how they influence the evaluation that we develop and are reviewing, but also the context of other folks' points of view and their interpretations of the evaluations that we're working with. And if you can advance the slide.
All right, thanks, Sharzi. So I am going to share with you an example that will hopefully start to illustrate what we're talking about. And this is really going to be a discussion. So please get ready to come off mute and engage with these slides that I'm going to share. I lived in Philadelphia for most of my 20s. And during that time, I got to know a bunch of folks. It's where I started education, research, and evaluation, like on a path towards doing that and doing more of that. And so while I was there, I was either sort of centrally or peripherally involved in 2 different research projects. And I know this is research, not evaluation, but I think the point of the exercise applies in both spaces for sure. And so what I'd like to do over the next few slides is just tell you a little about these 2 different research projects and have you make some observations about the 2 and where they're similar and where they're different. The 2 projects took place in 2005, 2010, and in Philadelphia. So we're similar time, similar place, and they both looked at what young people who left high school before graduating and trying to understand that phenomenon, which was and is very common in many places, including Philadelphia. So the first thing I'm going to share is the products that came out of these 2 projects were quite different. They both produced like a final report of their findings and recommendations. And I would be interested to pause here and actually, Libby, click one more time because I know the font is pretty small. There you can see a little more clearly the titles. What do you all observe, like just by looking at the final product, what visually it looks like and how it's titled? I'm just curious if you notice anything in that presentation that might reflect a slightly different lens. And I want to be clear in presenting these 2. Neither one's right? It's not like one study is going to be the one I'm going to hold up and the other one I'm not. It's an exercise in understanding how the who, in terms of who the researchers were, made a difference in the decisions they made all along the process even to titling their report and coming up with the layout. Oh, I clicked it as though I was going to the next slide. Thanks, Libby. All right, so here, just a brief introduction to the researchers. So the report on the left was written by two folks with a lot of credentials, highly educated, both white, both, we don't know their ages, but they look to be over 30 probably. Both are affiliated with universities. They have a PhD after their name. And then if you would click on the right, our researchers were a large group of young people that were part of what was called the Push Out chapter. So the Push Out chapter is a group, well, was a group. So this little snippet is actually pulled out of the report. The Push Out chapter is a group of Youth United for Change members who are either out of school or are students at alternative schools and programs. We are working to improve the school system for current and future students so that they do not get pushed out of school like we did. And this picture is not actually the group that did the research because I couldn't access a picture of that, but this was a more recent cohort of Youth United for Change young people. And so you can just start to imagine how the identities and lived experiences of these two sets of researchers gives them very different lenses on the issue of dropout or push out in Philadelphia. Next slide. All right, here again, I'm gonna have you observe and share what you notice is different. So these are the research questions for the two studies. The one on the left, one, what are the characteristics of students who drop out of Philadelphia's public schools? Two, which student characteristics can adults use to identify students as being at risk of dropping out? And then on the right, what are the most common reasons that young people leave Philadelphia schools before graduating? And two, what can local, state, and federal policymakers do to address the push-out crisis? What do you observe? And any thoughts on how the lens of the researchers might actually be showing up in the decisions they made about how to frame their research questions? I will say their methods were different. The one on the left used entirely quantitative analysis of existing data sets. They essentially took a huge amount of data from the Philadelphia Public School District and matched it at the student level with child welfare data. So they were able to start looking at system involvement and the relationship between system involvement and leaving high school early. The young people on the right did a survey of their peers. They developed the survey, and then because of who they were able to get access to lots of young people who had left school, and then also did focus groups. So anyway, thank you for engaging in that exercise as an illustration of what we're talking about today.
Thanks, Libby. So as you can see from the two examples that Deborah shared, it really is important to think about who is doing the research, who is doing the evaluation, and where their lived experiences come into play when they ask questions, develop questions, or develop that research. So we are going to give you some time right now to do a self-reflection activity, which is an identity chart activity that we have utilized before in some of our workshops. This is a non-exhaustive list of identities where it's going to ask you to list out your identities and then to really unpack and think about how you are, what do you think about those identities? So yeah, so we're gonna give you about 15 minutes to work through this and really unpack what these identities mean to you, how much you think about them or you don't think about them. And then the last column is to think about How do you think these identities show up in your approach to evaluation? So if you already have an evaluation program design plan that you are a part of, how do you think these identities that we have called out in this activity influence how you approach that evaluation? If you don't have an evaluation plan or approach that you were thinking about, you can use this as a time to start thinking through what do you think would come out if you were to start developing questions or thinking about who you would be evaluating or what aspects of your program?
So thank you everyone for taking some time individually to reflect. Keep those notes you made handy because not too long from now, we will be placing you again in breakout rooms. And I think some of your reflections from that discussion will actually, or from that reflection time will be helpful to that discussion. So I do want to talk briefly about the implications of all of this for evaluation. And there are many. I'm just going to touch on a few ways to think about this and also give you a moment to add if you have any that come to mind. So one of the implications I see and have seen is a question of who is involved. I think the idea that a single person can carry out an evaluation on their own, it certainly is done, and it brings a lot of limitations because of that one person's more limited perspective. So the idea of forming an evaluation team of some form is one way to help address the possible sort of unconscious bias you might bring to your evaluation. Another approach is to use participatory methods, which means not just that you collect data from those you consider to be your participants or your communities, but that you actually invite some of them to be part of your evaluation team and help with designing the evaluation itself. It's also important to maybe pause near the beginning of a project and consider who will benefit from this evaluation you're doing. Are there ways to expand who would benefit from it? And of course, thinking about who could be harmed, and especially who could be harmed without us even thinking about it because of our lenses and our biases. You can click, thanks, Libby. There's also some implications for design, actually tons of implications. But one approach is just to be really aware of decision points throughout the process of designing your evaluation. And when those decision points come up, take a moment, think about how you're going to make the decision, and think about how someone from a different identity might make the decision. Maybe you even invite them to help you make the decision. Through the whole data collection process, there's a lot of questions you can ask yourself around how the data collection experience would land for respondents from different identities. For example, if you're doing interviews, would there be a reason to have one person do the interview over another just to support the comfort of the respondent? Or in the way survey questions are worded, are there ways that bringing others' identities, keeping others' identities in mind might affect how you create your survey, whether you translate it in other languages? And of course, once you have that data and it comes in, someone is making meaning from it, deciding what it means. And getting help with that is another implication, thinking about the bias we bring to that process, checking ourselves on our bias, and inviting others to help us interpret. And then in yet another bucket, sort of how we present our findings can be really important. So there's ways to present in huge final reports, put together in a report that's really for a very technical audience, right? That would be one approach to presenting what we learned from our evaluation. Are there ways to make it more accessible? And in that presentation of our findings, are there ways we can be transparent about our process, our identities, our limitations, so that anyone who's looking at our findings and learning from them understands that they are part of the story, but not the whole story. So I think there's a lot in how I should say, I was traditionally taught to do evaluation that says to remove yourself from the story you're telling. This approach actually says the opposite. You want to name who you are as part of your presentation of the findings. And the final bullet there says avoid language that implies certainty. And there are evaluators out there who would disagree with me, but I would strongly encourage to avoid words like proof, like we have proved that, or we definitively know that, or this is a best practice. We found that this is a best practice, because that implies it's a best practice for everyone. And it might not be. It might be something that's promising in your setting, but to use language that implies certainty gives us a sense that what we found is true with a capital T for everyone.